If our panelists could join us, I'm looking out at this crowd here, and I'm wondering what an odd lot we are at the very end of this conference and talking about these esoteric trust issues. But the thing that I think we all have in common, and what I'd like to talk about in a conversational way, is three attributes to the kinds of systems that we're building. And those attributes, to my mind, are that these systems are widely decentralized from a computing point of view. They are cross-jurisdictional. They cross legal boundaries. And lastly, they're self-regulatory, these identity systems at scale, whether they're built on the blockchain or other kinds of technology. So the title of this discussion is Emerging Cross-Border Trust Services. And it really does connect with the earlier presentations that those of you that are here heard, whether those borders are national borders or state borders here in the US and elsewhere. So we're going to be talking about the role of different institutions and organizations in these cross-border systems. We'll be joined in a minute by our colleague from the UK, Martin. And let's start with the introductions. So I wonder, Rachel, you've already said a bit more about the light test project, so we have a sense of the kind of work that you're doing. I wonder if our friend from the US Post Office would give us a bit of introduction about what is the Post Office involvement in this cross-border world.
Sure. Hello. I guess I'll kick us off while our other panelists join us. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Lee. I manage the digital integration team at the Postal Service. What does digital integration mean? Really, I'm in charge of all of our identity services for the organization. Just to kind of kick it off and tell you a little bit about why Postal, why would we be sitting up here talking about identity? I would argue that the Postal Service has one of the largest trust frameworks of the U.S. government. My colleagues and I were sitting in the back of the room talking about different stats, and the United States Postal Service delivers over half the world's mail. That's a very large chunk. So the Postal Service has really been on a journey looking at how we bridge physical to digital. How do we stay relevant in this digital age? One of our new products is called Informed Delivery, and it's essentially for those that are U.S. citizens here. You can go online and sign up for Informed Delivery, but you can access images of your pieces of mail that's coming into your mailbox. Packages that will be delivered that day, and it's hugely valuable for our customers. We launched a little over a year ago, and we have 10 million subscribers. But as part of that journey, we really had to look at how do we know our customers? We're giving them access to very valuable information that could be used by the bad guys. And so it was very important for us to understand how are we going to go about this? How are we going to understand our customers? And so we've started down the path of identity proofing. And one of the things that we've learned is that, not everyone is going to pass a remote proofing scenario. We want the customers to sign up. How do we provide the different capability for them to sign up for our services if you can't pass through a remote proofing type world? And so we allow for our customers to come into our post offices and do an in-person proofing event. And it's really allowed us to expand our customer suite. And I would argue that, some of my other colleagues in the government are going to run into these same challenges. We talk about it all of the time. What happens if you can't get through a remote proofing scenario? And the Postal Service could be that we could provide that reach that we have in our existing retail footprint of over 34,000 post offices network-wide to help solve that problem for other agencies.
about the user experience and the primacy of the user experience in identity systems. What is it about the user experience in informed delivery that has caused 10 million people to sign up?
People are interested in what's coming into their mailbox. People travel. We're all here on a conference. We want to know if there's an important bill that's coming in. Maybe not so much, but if there's an important transaction, especially in a package economy. I mean, I myself get 3 to 4 packages delivered to me a week. It'd be nice to know what's coming to my address. And so really starting that kind of bridge from the physical to digital has been really key. And it allows us to expand for other services. And so not only are we sharing what's coming to them in the mailbox, but providing different advertising opportunities for our customers.
It sounds the piece that you got right, which we learned about from previous panels, was there's a real payoff for the user. You've hidden the complexity, and you allow them to have a valuable service delivered with a least amount of friction.
Absolutely. That's
Cool.
our hope.
That's our hope. Could you pass that microphone to Martin? And here's a quick test for those that are still here. What is the most trusted agency in the US government? Thank you, the Post Office. Martin, what's the most trusted agency in the UK government?
The Post Office, and I'll give you some data points to back that up in a minute. So apologies for missing the start, I must have a timetable change. So is it really helpful if I start off with giving you a bit of context on what we're doing at the moment in identity before we move on to the cross-border theme? So I lead we established in February a new identity business unit to really focus on driving growth in identity in the UK. There's 2 parts to the unit. So the first half is the very traditional branch-based identity work. So things like passport applications, driving licenses, visas, the type of work we've been doing for decades, providing a trusted connection between citizens in the state on their local high street. The second part is our gov.uk's Verify service. Now, if any of you in the previous session on what governments are doing in identity around the world, you'd have already heard about this. If you weren't, I'll give you a very quick summary. So gov.uk Verify is it's kind of the government's first attempt at a nationwide federated digital identity scheme. It's the idea that you should really only have to prove who you are once, and that gives you access to a wider range of government services online. So back in 2014, the government, in the wake of the national ID card fallout, so the UK government decided they weren't going to progress with national ID cards and instead go out to a consortium of mostly private sector providers to do identity proofing of citizens. So they appointed 7 different providers, of which Post Office is one of them. And so what we do for citizens is take them through a full identity verification journey, provide them the authenticators, and then they're good to go for accessing a wide range of government services. It's fair to say it's still early days. So across those panel of 7 providers, we've got up to 2.4 million users so far. I think it's proven a couple of things and established a couple of things. So for the UK as a whole, it's proven that a federated digital identity scheme can work, and probably most importantly, it's established some standards which a market can start to coalesce around. And those, as you'll have heard in the previous sessions, those standards have also been important in influencing the development of standards in other countries. For the Post Office, the thing it's proven is it's a purely online service at the moment. It was the Post Office's first purely online service, and we always knew we were a trusted brand on high street. What we found is we are getting about half of the market share through Verify, and it's effectively a brand beauty parade. As a customer, you go on to the government's hub, you're presented with a panel of up to 7 firms, and you choose which one do you trust to take you through this identity proofing process. And we're getting about half the market share. So a very hard data point to back up your question on that. We are one of the most trusted providers in the UK.
I can't let you go by without asking for a brand beauty contest. What did you mean by that exactly?
In the sense that, so as a user, in the UK, digital identity is still a very new concept. You've got no established market insight to understand what the different providers are doing. So you go on the panel and you'll see our name, you'll see Barclays, Experian, and then there's 3 or 4 startup names which you've never heard of before. And so really, take your pick. Which of those names do you trust to take you through an identity proofing journey and then look after your identity and keep you safe and secure?
I think it goes to this discussion that we had earlier about trying to capture that user experience. I know from work that I've done with Google, they measure to the millisecond how long it takes a user to move from one function to the next. So it sounds like the brand beauty contest is really helpful at that by giving a recognizable, trusted brand at the very start of that user journey.
Absolutely, and I think, digital identity is a very new concept. As we take a user through that process, we're asking them to share a lot of very sensitive details. We're asking them to upload their passport or driving license, provide all of their personal details, give us access to their financial information. So the trust of the brand is absolutely crucial. And what the Post Office has done is we've established trust over generations in the UK. We've been around for 4 centuries. For a long time, we've been the place we go to send sensitive mail, to open a bank account, to access government services. So I think that generational trust has proved really valuable as we move into the digital age.
I wonder if you and Lauren could talk a bit about identity proofing. It's my belief that it's really the least understood, but one of the most important parts of the systems of the steps in the ID systems at scale. Martin, do you want to give a bit about your thoughts on identity proofing now and in the future?
Yeah, sure. So, starting in the Verify experience, for both better and worse, what Verify did early on was define quite a high level of assurance for identity proofing. It set the bar at what we called an LOA2 initially. The good thing about that is it was secure enough to provide access to a wide range of government services, including benefits entitlements. The benchmarking against private sector standards suggests it's probably stronger than what most banks do for KYC purposes. So a pretty strong standard. The inevitable trade-off you get, though, is it's not easy to get people through that. And so what Verify has suffered from is fairly high dropout rates. So we're seeing about 55% conversion rates, and that's the best of all of the Verify providers. To kind of pick up one of the points Lauren talked about, at the moment, not using our branch network to back that up. One of the things we're looking at is bringing that in and seeing if that helps to increase the demographic coverage and get that conversion rate up further. We think there's a lot more we can do on the user journey to improve those conversion rates.
Lauren, I wonder if you could talk a bit about leveraging the assets of your branch systems and your footprint in this identity proofing piece.
Absolutely. So, when we look at in-person proofing today, we provide that service at over 300 locations across the country. That gets to about 80% of the U.S. population, but it still requires that person to come into the branch. So that the service has to be such that you want it so bad that you're willing to go in. And so the Postal Service has really kind of thought through, how do we make this accessible to everyone? And so we're looking to expand to all of our retail locations and be part of the transaction that you're having with the Postal Service every day. So you come in to buy stamps. Would you like to sign up for one of our extended services and do that identity proofing event at the point of sale? But really, the value that the Postal Service can offer is we can extend this to our carrier branch. Our carriers. We visit every house every day, 6 days a week, in some cases 7 days a week. And so over the course of the next year, we're going to be putting our identity proofing platform on our mobile delivery device and really giving that power to the carrier to do an identity proofing event at the point of delivery. And so if you combine that with delivery of things, there can be a lot of power that we can take advantage of.
Very cool. Rachel, now I'm going to ask you to tell a story.
Okay, a story.
begins in Mississippi and ends in Freiburg. Can you talk about
Ends in where?
in Germany?
Oh, okay.
So you had to identity proof yourself through a whole maze of systems in order to establish not only that it was you, but it was you with a set of verified attributes. Can you tell that story and then reference light tests to it?
Of course. Okay, so as most of you have probably questioned yourself, like, okay, is she American or is she German? Like, what is this answer? Well, I was raised in Wisconsin, so sometimes I have this Midwestern accent, but I did my bachelor's in Mississippi at Ole Miss. So hotty toddy if there's anybody in the audience or any person who knows somebody who graduated from there. And then after I went to Ole Miss, I wanted to try something different, so I got an internship at Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, and so I did that there at the Research Institute, and then I decided I wanted to get my master's in Germany. So I thought this should be easy, like Germany and the US, we're friends, and it's good. Well, in this application process, it proved to be a lot more trying than I ever expected. I had all of my diplomas and everything, and I had to get so many different notaries from the city. Ole Miss is in Oxford, Mississippi, so I had to get a stamp from Oxford, Mississippi, from the state, from Frankfurt, and from my local one in Esslingen where I was living, just for them to prove that my diploma was in fact a real document. So this was just with my diploma, so I had to also do this for plenty of other documents. And then the next one would be my transcripts. So, of course, if you want to get into a master's program, they have to see that you at least passed your first degree, right? So in the US, I had a 3.82 or something. So in the US, that's pretty okay. So I was like, okay, awesome. Well, in Germany, they have an inverted scale. So 4.0 is almost failing. So I also, of course, had to get my grades translated. So there's one university in Germany that translates all of the grades for all international students. So you can probably expect a very long wait period of at least a few months. So, and then even with that, then you're not even sure because they do it by hand. So sometimes it comes back, and then if you want to argue against any of the grades translations, then of course that extends the time that they would be translated. So with that, at the end of the day, I did end going to the master's program, and I graduated. So it did work out, so the story does have a happy end. However, with Lightest, this process could have been a lot more simple. So if one would use Lightest, they could say, okay, so I have a digital version of my diploma, which is stamped by the US Department of Education. So Germany could be like, okay, so our Ministry of Education accepts all US diplomas that has this US Department of Education stamp or certificate and whatnot. So this could be automized. Then it would be, all this notarization issues would be solved very quickly. And also the translation. So the translation also with Lightest, the Ministry of Education in Germany, they could decide upon how they would translate from the US scale to the German scale, separately from how the US would translate the German's grading system to the US grading system. So there would not have to be a bilateral agreement or acceptance of either of these translations. So hopefully it would be 1-to-1, so 3.8 would then be 1.2. However, if the Germans would decide, well, if they would, maybe they would say that the US education system is maybe a bit more difficult than ours, then maybe I would get a 1.0, or of course it could go the other way around. However, this could be a digitalized solution that would have made this process a lot easier for people who are looking to maybe study in other countries to be able to do that in a more efficient way.
So there's the use case, and I wonder if the two postal authorities could think through that trying experience that our friend Rachel had, and where might infrastructure that the postal services, where could they bring value or remove friction or provide more trust for the different transactions that Rachel described in that journey? I'm surprising these guys with this question. I wanted to see what happened.
Sure. So I think, it's a fantastic use case and kind of really highlights the problems people get when they move country. You have to go through whatever position you have in your host country. When you move to a new country, you start with no records in the credit bureaus. You don't have an address history. You kind of start back at square one. So I think creating the ability to recognize established identities in another country and recognize them in the new country makes a huge amount of sense. In the UK, for example, around half of all the bank accounts opened each year are from people who are new to the country. So it's a very large market. In terms of your specific question, Don, on what role can the posts play? So I think there's a couple of things. Firstly, the fact that, coming back to the Verify points, what Verify is established in the UK is the first of a digital identity trust framework in the UK. So, we've got one trust framework in the UK. Next step for us is to expand that out into the private sector and get far greater coverage across a much broader range of transactions. That means we've then got a trust framework which we can offer for our citizens to, if they want to move to the US, for example, they can hopefully port that trust framework over to the new country. In one of the earlier sessions, we heard about the example of that being done when the trial of that happening in Canada. So a customer of a UK Verify account taking it to Canada and opening up a bank account with TD Bank. So that's the first thing we can provide. We can anchor customers with that recognised UK trust framework and support initiatives to recognise it elsewhere. I think for customers moving the other direction, everyone knows what a post office does. You may not be specifically familiar with the UK post office, but from whatever country you come from, you know the role of the national postal operator. And so when you're new to country, you may not recognise the names of the banks, but you can put a lot of trust in the domestic postal operator. So I think we're a kind of natural place to go when you're new to country and you're looking for a helping hand to go through that process. So I think the fact that we are long established trust anchor is important when people are moving across borders.
Lauren, do you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, we talked about a little bit before is what happens if you can't remote proof. As a student, you might not have a long credit history, and a lot of our remote proofing is based on a person's credit history. And so what happens to this new student who may be signing up for financial aid or looking to establish a digital identity? What happens if you can't establish that online? And so I definitely think the Post have a position to play in that space and helping you get started with your digital identity. We also happen to have a lot of addressing information, and so helping establish that residency information for you as one of the attributes that's associated with your identity as you move.
That sounds really good to me. What sounds good is that I think the Postal Services have a unique role in this transition from the very cumbersome process that Rachel described, full of friction and inefficiencies and cost, to a movement where each of those functions can be automated, can be mechanized, digitalized, whatever we call it. But the notion of the trust framework is something I want to return to. So when I think of trust frameworks, I think about a legal agreement that basically articulates the responsibilities of those involved in a multi-party contract. So could each of you talk about the role that trust frameworks or trust schemes play in the kinds of use cases and markets that you want to address, particularly as we begin to cross borders? How can we have the trust framework that gets established by the USPS better sync up with that of the post office in the UK?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the core of the Postal Service, and our core is shipping. One of the things, global e-commerce is continuing to rise. People are shipping packages from Europe, China, you name it. And it's very important as we're taking packages in country and they're going through and ultimately being delivered by the United States Postal Service that we trust the shippers that are sending those packages. And so the Postal Service is really working with the larger post community to start establishing those trust frameworks. And I think there's some real opportunity to leverage some of the newer identity solutions, creating digital identities as part of building that trust framework. So somewhere in the UK, you might establish that trust relationship that you could pass on to the Postal Service here in the United States that says, yes, this person is valid, they are a trusted person, and they are shipping goods to the United States. You might be able to bypass some of your processes when we do some of the verification when it comes stateside to ultimately deliver. So really looking at how you reduce the cycle time of the overall delivery of the package by leveraging some of the trust that's established.
Martin, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. So I think there's probably two steps. So in establishing internationally recognised trust framework. So the first obvious step is you need to establish it domestically. And to repeat the earlier point, probably the single most valuable thing which Verify has done is establish that domestic trust framework to standards which are very transparently published and a wide range of players in the UK can recognise. What we're going through right now is making sure those standards are recognised and used not just by government entities but also by a broadening range of private sector players. So that's step one. If that's not hard enough, probably the second step is starting to get those trust standards mapped across each country's own trust standards. In Europe, a really big step's been taken forward through the EIDAS regulations, which does a number of things, but in the field of digital identity means each member state's national digital identity scheme can be mapped across to other member states. And there's a commitment to recognise each member state's digital identity schemes. So if you've gone through an identity proofing process in Germany, we should recognise that in the UK for access to public services. It is at the moment only for government services. The next frontier is to, again, expand it out into the private sector. So that should give us good coverage for the EU. Sadly, you would have thought digital identity would be top of the negotiating list for the Brexit negotiations, but the UK government has parked that for the moment. My expectation is we will stay in the EIDAS regulations and Verify will be notified to EIDAS, which means the UK will have that pan-EU sharing scheme, whatever happens with Brexit. That covers us for the EU. There's already been some early work to map standards in the UK, UK's Verify, over to North American standards, so both with Canada and the US. So there's a bit of a kind of English-speaking coalition there looking at standards there. The other coalition which I can see emerging is Australasia. So both New Zealand and Australia are doing really great things on identity at the moment. They're also kind of pushing the boundaries of national ID schemes. We clearly have strong links and ties to both of those countries. So we're in some early stage conversations with participants over there about how we map our standards across to theirs. So you can it's a bit like throwing pebbles into a pond. We've thrown a pebble into the pond for the UK, which has created this circle of trust. There's a much bigger circle emerging for the EU, and over time that should overlap with what's emerging in Australia, New Zealand, and North America. And over time we'd start to join that up.
That analogy of the ripple effect in the pond, I want to get back to our friend Rachel and her use case. So Rachel's problem was not only establishing that she was Rachel, but that these documents, diplomas and grades, were to be trusted as well. And each of you have hinted at it in terms of the role of the Postal Service, not only in providing identities for people, but also identities for the things that you ship, right? For package delivery. So if these folks were playing buzzword bingo, they would really like to hear the word, the identity of things, right? IoT. Or if they were playing a drinking game, they would slug it when we said IoT. So can you take some of the infrastructure and trust services that we've talked about it and extend that to the kinds of documents or packages that you've described? So Rachel has talked about it in terms of light test as the validation of not only the person, but the thing, that invoice that the PEPL project is to be delivering in a trusted way. Does that make sense? Should we give that a try?
Sure. So, I spoke a little bit about us providing our in-person proofing app to our carriers that visit every house every single day. So we could quickly see us doing in-person proofing events tied to a physical package. It might be valuable for our customers to say, this thing, device, whatever it might be, was delivered to this person at this address, potentially even to this geolocation at this time. And so we see that this could really help support the Internet of Things and providing different data points, especially as we see people move so much. And a lot of the value is ensuring that we're getting the shipment to the right person at the right address.
Rachel, does that make sense in a light test contest about how we establish trusted relationships that involve not only the identity of things or identity of people, but assurances about whether that document or that invoice or that procurement information is to be trusted?
I would say that in a light test, or like what we're doing with this trust infrastructure, is that you're not only limited to just like verifying different trust schemes, but also the translation aspect, which could also entail into this whole trust scheme mapping situation, because then you could, or whatever entity would like to decide how something would be translated, that they could. So we have, like just from our project alone, we've gotten a lot of countries outside of Europe who are seeing our project and who are like, okay, well, we would really love if our trust scheme could be translated somehow into EIDAS, especially countries who are interested in strengthening their ties with Europe. So one country in particular is Azerbaijan, where they have a trust scheme and they want to help us in kind of showcasing how a trust scheme from an outside of Europe country could be translated to a European trust scheme. And I think that overall this can help our mapping issue and also kind of utilize how we can use trust schemes to their full potential.
I'd like that idea, because we now have a physical notarization process that we're trying to disrupt and make more efficient. And what we want to do is to be able to have a trusted framework that allows, as Lauren was suggesting, a great deal of confidence that this person and this document and perhaps the translation of that document can be trusted throughout this transaction. It seems to me that the Postal Services and this light test project is really trying to test the role of your institutions in an environment where best practice is really zero trust. So we have the kind of juxtaposition of historically trusted organizations in an environment, in an internet identity environment, where best practice is to verify the transaction, whether that's the person, the time, and the place. Do you see that as kind of the future, Martin, for the role that the post office can play?
I think absolutely, and I think we're still in the footholds. The real magic happens when you start to combine the identity of people and the identity of things. You know, if we take your example of e-commerce, if we can solve the identity of people problem, and if you think about cross-border trade, cross-border e-commerce, a large bit of our customer base is eBay customers, eBay power sellers, if they want to send a high-value item to someone in another country, they need to know something about the worthiness of that individual in the other country. If we've solved a mutually recognised way of identifying those people, then you've solved that bit. It's not far-fetched to believe the economics of IoT is going to come down to the extent that that can start to be added to parcels, and you've then got a means of tracking the fulfillment of that parcel all along. So you've kind of completed the circle of trust for all elements of that e-commerce transaction. So I think there's huge potential, absolutely.
It's interesting that eBay, like so many other new digital images, are really built on top of existing trusted infrastructure. Whether that's eBay or Amazon, that they've been able to leverage the brand, the trust frameworks, and the infrastructure that postal services have. I don't know if that's too hot a topic for you, Lauren, but can you, I don't mean the political side of that, but how do you see the post office coexisting with e-commerce?
I think that the Postal Service plays a very relevant role. I mean, we're almost the backbone of shipments and delivery, and so the Postal Service needs to work with our other providers, other service providers, as well as our customers, to ensure that we keep the integrity of the delivery, and that people can continue to trust that the Postal Service, as well as other service providers, will deliver to its customers.
I like that notion, the integrity of the delivery, and that means that we have to trust the people involved, the transport mechanisms. We'd like to be able to timestamp it in a authoritative way so that those trusted transactions can make it across physical borders as well as regulatory borders. Can you talk a bit about how regulations impact the work that you're doing? And I'm going to ask each of you because, Rachel, you've got the rather Byzantine set of regulations in Europe that is changing before our very eyes through PSD2 and open banking and EIDAS.
Sure. It's a kind of a complex question. There are many regulations that the Postal Service needs to abide by. But before I go there, part of building out that trust framework is to be able to provide visibility to our customers, both the shipper and the receiver. So we're continuously improving upon our trust, I guess I should say, by the repeatability of our process. And being able to share with our customers the visibility that once that package leaves the shipper's hands, you're getting updated on the progress of that package through delivery. And so I think visibility plays a key component. In terms of some of the standards and regulations, if we talk about from an e-commerce standpoint, the Postal Service provides a very viable and important role in the delivery of goods from other countries. So does Customs and Border Patrol, and the Postal Service will continue to support CBP in their processes and ensuring that we're providing the data and information that they need to do their job. The Postal Service also has a role to protect the privacy of our consumers, of all of the citizens within the United States. And so as we embark on this identity journey, I think privacy is one of the key components that we will continue to really think about. The privacy of that individual, the privacy of the address that individual lives at, and how can we continue to protect that information, as well as even improve upon it. When we're looking at that name or that person associated with that address, and them really wanting to share, keep that close to vest. Maybe they don't want to share it as widespread as they do today with every vendor that they're going online and purchasing from. I think the Post really have an opportunity to really think about addressing a little bit differently, and how we can protect that information or help that citizen protect that information.
Rachel, does that how does that play into both the regulatory environment that you're working in, but also the way you're leveraging the DNS system?
Well, I would say from a LITES standpoint that we are actually trying to avoid to get involved in any of these regulatory and legal legislative issues or changes and whatnot. I mean, LITES itself is not trying to change any legislation. However, it's basically a tool that can enable people to decide upon themselves between these like trust schemes. So of course, if EIDAS would change their trust scheme, then that's up to EIDAS, and then you would have to maybe change your trust scheme or change your rules on what you would, your trust policy or your rules of what to accept related to that like external change of EIDAS. However, yeah, from a tool itself, we try to avoid any legal responsibility for the entities using LITES. And I mean, we're going to be providing a legal tool set or suggestions of how to use it, and also privacy by design tools to help users be more aware of this. I think that's all I can really say.
Before Martin answers, I just want to give a heads up to the audience. You've seen what delight I have in torturing our panelists, so I invite you to join in. We'll let Martin answer that, and then we'll ask for questions from the audience.
So on the regulatory question, and if we start by restating what we're looking to achieve, so our belief is everyone should have access to a secure, safe digital identity, which makes it easy to prove who they are and access the services they want, whether that's opening a bank account, starting a new job, renting or buying a house. There's a few beacons of light on the regulatory landscape, most of it in truth coming from Europe. So EIDAS is a great step forwards. GDPR is the fact that it's very privacy enhancing, really supports what we're looking to do in digital identity. If I'm honest, most of the UK regulatory landscape when it comes to identity proofing is still designed for a paper-based world. And if I give a small example of that, the UK's introduced right-to-work regulations, which means every employer has to check an individual has the right to work in the UK. They're either a citizen or they've got a residence permit. The Home Office guidance on this still dictates that the employer inspects the identity documentation in person, which just doesn't reflect today's economy, the fact that employers everywhere are employing people at the other side of the country. The idea that you have to force that prospective employee to travel across the country and show your documentation in person, doesn't reflect the economy we live in. So one of our big push of governments at the moment, the single most useful thing they can do to support the growth of digital identity is update all of the regulations so it explicitly recognises and supports the use of digital identity. And I think there's a long way to go there, really.
Do I have any takers in the audience for a question that would enliven our... There we go. Diane?
I'm really interested in the cross-border side of this. Do you think this is something that governments need to drive, or do you think the private sector will drive this? And how will it move forward, given that legislation in countries is quite difficult and quite different across the countries? So what's the private sector role in this, and what's the government role in this?
Thank you.
Sure. Well, I think most of you probably sat in for the sessions earlier on with Jeremy and Joel. I think from the United States perspective, we definitely see that the government has a role. I think that role is still yet to be defined, to be quite honest. I think the United States is still working through that. What I can say is that we think that our position is that the Postal Service has a role to help with this, whether it be from a public or private sector. With some of our CSPs, we'd like to support the overall greater good.
Your CSP.
Credential service providers.
Great.
I mean, it'd be fantastic if both government and private sector were pulling in the same direction. My suspicion, when I think what governments, the first responsibility is to make sure they're creating the right framework for digital identity domestically. Governments everywhere are hugely distracted at the moment with other things, so my prediction would be we're more likely to see the drive for this coming from the private sector, and I wouldn't frankly wait for governments to create those interoperability standards. I think the drive for this, the economic need, is going to come from the private sector. So that's probably where I'd predict the fastest progress.
Rachel, you talked about the tools that you expect to come out of the light test work. Could you just describe them briefly? What are these tools that might result from light test, and how might they be applied in cross-border trust services?
Well, with Lighthouse, we are also going to be providing kind of like a standardized way to create like a trust policy, or to like kind of enable people that's not even just like from a governmental standpoint, but also from the industry standpoint. So being able to, how do you make a trust policy? What would this look like? Or standardized way to maybe even make a trust scheme. So this would also provide tools of how one could do this without like having to reinvent the wheel every time. So I think maybe this could also be a driving factor to kind of assist in this initiative. Well, I mean,
Policies bear that, or test that proposition. Excuse me, the pilots that you have.
yeah,
within.
the pilots. Yeah, actually, both pilots would probably be considered to be private trust schemes. So the PEPAL pilot is private, and then also Curios, the Spanish Postal Service, is kind of an in-between, private and public. So, but also, I mean, the UNHCR, it's not per se a private organization. However, I don't think it's considered to be a public organization either. So maybe it does kind of hit different kind of variations of what a trust scheme or what kind of entity would be important in what parts of establishing a trust scheme. We are also implementing, this cross-border use case with Azerbaijan. So this is between Azerbaijan and EIDAS, or Europe, because I mean, as we're funded by the EU, we have to showcase the EIDAS as well. So, so this would be a cross-border use case that we're doing, and then in the UNHCR use case, it would also probably in the end also be cross-border, because I mean, these refugees would be from all over like Syria or like Mauritania, different countries, and they would want to study in another country, so this would also be cross-border.
Thank you. So the way this works with your friendly moderator, if you don't ask questions, I'm going to ask questions of you. So John Fontana, you've only been here for 10 minutes, but that's no excuse. You've heard a lot about this trust framework stuff in the context of identity. Does it make any sense to you? And how do you describe it when you're writing an article in one of the publications that you are affiliated with?
Boy. I couldn't make it to the door fast enough. No, I would say that, you know, I look at it as sort of a set of parameters, a playing field, and to know, to be cognizant of when you go outside of the lines.
Fair enough. So Andre, you talked about aligning the self-interests of different stakeholders. How does this trust framework stuff help that alignment between stakeholders with very different financial incentives, very different regulatory environments, very different mandates from government?
One of the things that I kind of see with the post offices around the world actually is I think they're totally underselling or underseeing what they are. And when I hear you describe your business, what I hear you think is you're in the logistics business for parcels and packages, and that's true, but I think that's too small a frame. I would argue you're in the trusted transactions business. That's what you've always been in. And so the challenge is originally in the economy, like the post office was key. If we wanted to get a deal done in the transaction, we had somebody with money, we had somebody with goods, and we needed paper to get terms and agreements between them. You always carried the paper, always. But the challenge as we moved to digital is went point to point. And so you kind of lost your role in this thing of making deals happen in the economy. What we found is at scale is that we don't have a trust mechanism between the parties at scale, and so blockchain is emerging, trying to create trust out of nothing. And so what I see when I look at the post office is you guys could kind of run circles around blockchain if you got your stuff together. And so what's interesting from a post office point of view is the first thing is you've got fiat trust from government. By mandate, you're the only carrier in the country. More importantly, you have legal precedent trust. Your stuff is, your stamp on paper is referenced in legal cases around the world. So you have precedent trust. And then you also have consumer trust because you're in the communities around the world, and we're not leveraging those assets well enough in helping the digital economy work. And I do like your idea of let's use our carriers to get out to the homes and let's do digital proofing that way. I think that's an awesome idea. But we're underselling the value of being able to basically say, we saw this happen here, here, and here, because that would go a long way to increasing trust between all the participants. So I think we're underdoing what post office could do in the economy, totally underdone. But to take a step further, I think one of the challenges, you also got to get the story right. And when I hear your story, my experience in being connected with Connect.gov is you got to choose your partners carefully. And so your brand comment kind of caught my attention because what do you call it, brand beauty? One of the things that's important for successful brands is you need consistency and experience for people to trust the brand. And the challenge, if you choose a mishmash of providers, you don't have any consistency. And my experience from Connect.gov is we chose a really crazy set of providers. We had Google, Experian, Symantec, and who was the other one? There's one more. Anyway, all good companies, but when you look at it on a single eye chart, it looks like Sesame Street. These guys don't belong together, right? And so we're asking Joe Internet in Idaho to understand why he's using his Norton antivirus to get the IRS, or I could use Google instead. And it was like, this doesn't make any sense to me. So my own view is we need to have homogeneity in providers, not all the same, but it's got to be consistent. Not anybody who can do the job is so. Anyway, my challenge to you is just to rethink the role you could play in a digital economy. Like, we can run circles around blockchain if post office gets its job together.
Well, Martin?
It's very eloquently put, and I couldn't agree more, in short. I think us playing the role as a trust tank in the digital economy, I think there's a good commercial reason to do so. Every postal operator in the world is suffering with structural challenges to some of its core markets. So it'd be nuts not to take up that opportunity. And I think we've also got a social responsibility. You know, as you say, we've got long-established legal, government, and consumer trust established over generations. And if we're not lending that to make digital economies function more effectively, to function more fairly, what we can do is make sure every group is able to participate in the digital economy and we're not leaving groups behind. So I think we've got a huge opportunity and a huge responsibility to make that work. So I think it's wonderfully put.
Lauren, it must be terribly frustrating to hear comments like this as a leader of basically a transformation effort within the post office. How would you respond to Andre saying that you're underselling yourself?
I wouldn't say it's terribly uncomfortable. Kudos to you. Thank you for supporting us. It's nice to have supporters in the room and really look at the power of the Postal Service and how we can help with the digital transformation. The Postal Service internally is looking at how do we power to move to the digital age and how can we help support the rest of the economy in doing so.
It reminds me of the original, one of the keynotes about the power of a platform. And we've talked about the power of brands. And this gentleman is going to talk about...
I have a question, actually.
Good.
So I was wondering how a post-ID proofing or verification could interact with other government services. As a government provider, I'm really interested in how the carriers could go out and do an in-person proofing and how that could help other government programs.
Sure. So I think, one of the things that we've talked about before, is really all of the agencies are plagued by fraud. And how are they addressing these fraud issues with citizens trying to sign up for services? You want to let the trusted citizens in. You want them to access the service. You want to support the community, but it's important to keep the bad guys out. And so I believe that across agencies, we're really posed with a problem. How do we best do this? How do we take the friction out of the transaction, but yet still have the security inherent to the process? And so we see that the Postal Service can help with that access to the American public. Really, there's going to be unserved markets. There are going to be underbanked markets. There are going to be citizens that don't have established credit. How are other agencies going to address signing these individuals up for services and unlocking the potential of the service that we can provide our citizens? The Postal Service can do that, and we can do it in a way where there's low friction by empowering our carriers to help bridge and bind the citizen to the agency and unlock the service for them. So we see that we can provide that service to other agencies. And then you can have, once you have that proofing event, a credential is provided, and that credential can then be shared across other agencies to open up services. And so that's kind of the vision of the Postal Service and where we see ourselves in this game. I think UK Post is certainly further along.
I should have explained a bit of context early on. We do have one advantage, which is back in 2012, the government separated the retail network and the consumer-facing bit of the post office from the logistics bits. So the post office is the retail network and consumer-facing bits. Royal Mail is the logistics network. And I think that probably has liberated us to focus on some of these more forward-looking areas like digital identity. We don't have the hard, difficult legacy business of all of the logistics. So I think we may be further along, but it's because we've got some advantages. We don't have all of the hard stuff you've got to deal with.
Rachel. Light Test is leveraging a trust network called the DNS system. How are you doing that, and why?
Well, basically, since our goal is actually to have a globally trusted infrastructure, the global part is pretty essential. And to create a global network ourselves within a 3-year time span, that was just not feasible. So in the proposal process, we're thinking, well, what already exists? And this is when we started thinking, okay, yeah, the DNS is already something that's accepted among many countries in the world and also companies. And how can we better utilize this network that is already existing? And yeah, we've definitely gone through our processes of how we want to use that during this research project. And we've also changed kind of the role of how we would use it, but the thing that hasn't changed is basically that we use it in the sense of kind of the GPS or this connecting factor, this network. So we're not like holding any of the information that is transferred on it. However, the main asset all along was that it was already an existing global network that was accepted.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed me torturing these poor people. It's the sadistic side of me comes out late into the conference. I'll ask each of them just to give a quick kind of what I've learned at Identiverse as a way of wrapping up. Who wants to go first?
Sure.
What'd you learn at Identiverse from your perspective?
What did I learn? I learned that I have a lot more to learn. Every time I come to one of these conferences, it really opens kind of my mind and where the industry is moving, where it's going, and still where are some of the challenges and how our organization can fit in. So I learned that I have more questions today than I did yesterday, and I think that that's a good place for us all to be in.
For me, I would say that it's about the same, but it's kind of funny because, well, I'm a researcher, right? So, I mean, I'm always trying to learn and ask as more questions every day. However, when you come to like one of these conferences, you realize it in real time, and you see all of these people, all of these sources right in front of you with all of their knowledge and inspiration. So it's actually kind of nice to have like a physical aspect and not just having your head in a book all day. So that was refreshing, and I definitely learned many new facets of identity and it just in general.
What I'll pick out is the quote I've loved the most in this whole conference is from the Estonian ex-CIO last night. I'm not going to try and pronounce his name. So, he was describing this utopian state they've reached where because of the characteristics of Estonia, they've been able to get to critical mass of digital identity and all of their citizens are benefiting. But the point he made is people move fast when something is good, and that for me is really what we've got to do in the UK with digital identity. If we make it a good product, connect it to far more services, make it easy to use, make it trusted and secure, the adoption will start to come very rapidly, and we'll see that exponential growth.
Well, one last surprise, or turning around, I'd like the panelists to applaud the audience for hanging in there all the way through the very end of the day. Now you can return the favor. Thank you all for coming.